Dwight D. Eisenhower took office in 1953 as the confrontation with communism dominated America's relations with the rest of the world. Eisenhower developed new Cold War strategies, from greater reliance on nuclear weapons to the use of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agencies, for covert action to forestall an all-out nuclear conflict. He ended the Korean War and avoided military involvement in Indochina. By the time he left office in 1961, he felt compelled to warn the nation of the great dangers posed by the military-industrial complex, largely of his own making, but his Democratic successor, John F. Kennedy, would discover just how difficult it was to escape the Cold War frame of mind in shaping American foreign policy. Eisenhower's success in ending the Korean War set the tone for his administration and increased his popularity. As president, Eisenhower sustained the anti-communist rhetoric of Cold War diplomacy, and his administration persuaded Americans to accept the Cold War stalemate as more or less a permanent fact. At the core of Eisenhower's political philosophy lay a conservative vision of community. The majority of the American public, however, evidently agreed with Eisenhower's easygoing approach to his office. In running the White House and overseeing his administration, Eisenhower adopted the staff system with which he had effectively managed the unwieldy Allied forces during World War II. In his cabinet appointments, Eisenhower favored men congenial to the corporate interests they were charged with regulating. At the same time, Eisenhower accepted the New Deal legacy of greater federal responsibility for social welfare, but was cautious in approving new spending, even when facing mild recessions in 1953 and 1958. Eisenhower feared starting an inflationary spiral more than he worried about unemployment or poverty, and overall real wages grew steady on his watch. Stalin's death in March 1953 did not lead to a hopeful thaw in US-Soviet relations. Facing a Cold War with no end in sight, but fearing creation of a garrison state, Eisenhower pursued a high-tech, capital-intensive defensive policy that emphasized America's qualitative advantage in strategic weaponry, and military spending fell from 66% to 49% of the budget during his 2 terms. Despite new-look threats of massive retaliation to any Soviet provocation, Eisenhower refused to act when East Berliners rebelled in 1953 or Hungary revolted in 1956, tacitly acknowledging a Soviet sphere of influence. In 1958, probing American intentions and hoping to redirect the Soviet economy toward the production of more consumer goods, unilaterally suspending nuclear testing. Eisenhower, meanwhile, planned his own friendship tour of the Soviet Union. But in May 1960, the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane gathering intelligence on Soviet military installations, thus ending any potential thaw. The Soviet Union's dramatic launch of Sputnik, the first space-orbiting satellite, in October 1957, upset many Americans' precarious sense of security. Although Eisenhower knew there was no missile gap, he used the crisis to create NASA for space exploration and missile research, and a National Defense Education Act funding science and foreign language education. He also acquiesced to an unnecessary $8 billion increase in defense spending. And here in this photo, we see Nikita Khrushchev enjoying a snack on his American tour. On this trip, he also called for Soviet-American friendship, but in another breath, he boasted that we, the Soviet Union, will bury you. Eisenhower named Allen Dulles, the brother of the Secretary of State and a former leader of the wartime Office of Strategic Services, to head the CIA. Dulles sent covert agents across the globe not only to collect information, but also to provide secret support to friendly regimes and political parties. With a spreading anti-colonization movement in Africa and Asia, the Soviets offered an aid to anti-imperialists, leading Eisenhower to fear threats of anti-Americanism that might threaten economic and security interests. If hotspots burst into flame, he was prepared to use covert countermeasures and military intervention. In Iran, 1953, a popular but left-leaning regime in Iran threatened the Middle Eastern energy supplies. The CIA financed and sponsored an overthrow of Masada government and returned the repressive Shah to power. Oil supplies were secure, but American support for the Shah fed anti-Americanism in Iran. U.S. recognition of Israel that was created in 1948 also created major tensions. The Arab countries launched an all-out attack on Israel in 1948, immediately after the US and Soviet Union had recognized its independence. Israel repelled the attack but expelled Palestinians and grabbed Arab territory. Egyptian leader Abdel Gamal Nasser provoked another crisis in 1956 by signing an aid deal with the Soviets and threatening to nationalize the Suez Canal. When British, French, and Israeli forces attacked Egypt in October 1956, the United States refused to support her NATO allies and sponsored a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire and a withdrawal of foreign forces. Open U.S. support for Israel, however, led many Arab nationalists to return to the USSR for support. Meanwhile, in Guatemala, a 1954 CIA-sponsored coup overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who had threatened to expropriate land from the American-based United Fruit Company, installing the pro-American Colonel Arras, who promptly launched a reign of terror against real and suspected enemies. President Eisenhower publicly denied any knowledge of CIA activities, but the intervention sparked an anti-American backlash in Latin America. In Indochina, the United States provided France with massive military aid and CIA cooperation in its desperate struggle to maintain its colonial empire. Despite a French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, Eisenhower refused to support national reunification elections and supported Ngo Dinh Diem, an unpopular and repressive South Vietnamese leader who only held power with American economic and military support. The 1955 SEATO Pact, including the United States, Great Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, the Philippines, and Pakistan, underlined America's commitment to containment in Southeast Asia, foreshadowing the Vietnam War of the 1960s. With the title of his influential book, The Affluent Society, written in 1958, economist John Kenneth Galbraith gave a label to post-war America. While American capitalism had worked quite brilliantly in the years since World War II, Americans, he argued, needed to spend less on personal consumption and more on schools and social services. The deeply held popular belief in the right to a continuously expanding economy and a steadily increasing standard of living, even against the backdrop of global anxieties associated with the Cold War, shaped American social and political life. Federal aid helped people to buy homes, attend college and technical schools, and live in newly built suburbs. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, established in 1934, extended the government's role in subsidizing the housing industry. The FHA ensured long-term mortgage loans made by private lenders for home building. The mortgage interest deduction proved an important middle-class tax benefit for millions of post-war homebuyers. Yet, FHA policies also had long-range drawbacks, institutionalizing racial and income segregation of suburbia in public policy. The majority of suburbs were built as planned communities, such as Williams Levitt towns, which became a model for the growing middle class. However, most of the suburbs were all white. The GI Bill helped many veterans buy suburban houses and loaned millions to get college degrees or vocational training, further boosting the middle class. The Interstate and Defense Federal Highway Act of 1956 boosted post-war growth, especially in the suburbs, and stimulated the automobile industry while shortchanging public transportation. In response to Sputnik, the NDEA supported K-12 and college programs in math, science, and languages, while continued spending on defense programs and military bases created well-paying civilian jobs, encouraged by congressional sponsors who benefited from spending in their districts. And here we have an aerial view of development of Levittown in New York, and we see that mass production techniques were key to providing affordable housing in these post-war suburbs. And while these may not look any different to what we see today, these are a new phenomenon in the 1950s, this cookie-cutter approach to architecture and urban and suburban development. And here we have commuter train, Philadelphia, 1955. So the suburbia created a new concept of commuting to work, and we also see increased production in cars. And if you look at these graphs, we see how suburban growth came at a cost of degradation on the older inner cities. Here is just an example from Los Angeles County population from 1920 to 1980, and the diversity within that population. Looking at life in the suburbs, suburban life unquestionably represented an improvement in material conditions for many post-war families. The suburban boom strengthened the domestic ideal of the nuclear family as the model for American life. Suburban domesticity was usually presented as the woman's only path to happiness and fulfillment, until Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, written in 1963, raised a dissonant voice. We'll talk more on that when we get to the 60s. However, for millions of suburban families, the middle-class life could only be achieved with two incomes. Taking jobs largely in clerical, white-collar, and other service fields, married women looked to supplement their income and ensure a solidly middle-class standard of living for their family. We see the post-war rebirth of religious life was strongly associated with suburban living. Now, looking at these ads from the 1950s, if you look at the ad on the right, Mornadine, you would 1950s admin would have you believe that women were only good for two things: housework and having children, which included sex. The inability to perform any of these tasks could spell chaos and disorder for any husband. Luckily, we have this Mornadine, a drug for morning sickness. Women who were pregnant could continue to make breakfast for the whole family, and everything would go back to normal again, thanks to the miracle of this new drug. And which woman, if we look at this Hoover ad on the right, wouldn't love a brand new Hoover for Christmas? And here's some more ads from the 1950s about coffee, food processors, and mixers, for example. By the mid-1950s, American trade unions reached their peak as a share of the labor market, reflecting the enormous gains made during the New Deal and World War II. By the mid-1950s, American trade unions reached their peak as a share of the labor market, reflecting the enormous gains made during the New Deal and World War II. Union influence on political life, especially within the Democratic Party, also had increased. George Meany, the brusque, cigar-chomping head of the AFL, seemed the epitome of the modern labor boss, focusing on improving the economic well-being of their members while loyally spouting anti-communist rhetoric. while CIO leader Walter Reuther had been more outspoken in his demands for social and political change. He supported the 1955 merger that created the AFL-CIO and brought some 12.5 million union members under one banner. The merger marked the apex of trade union membership, and after 1955, its share of the labor market began a slow and steady decline. Scandals involving union corruption and racketeering hurt the movement's image. In 1959, Congress passed the Landrum-Griffin Act, which widened government control over union affairs and further restricted union use of picketing and secondary boycotts during strikes. Only 400,000 government workers belonged to unions in 1955, but public sector employees would be a growing segment of the union movement from the 1950s onwards. David Reisman in The Lonely Crowd, 1950, argued that modern America had given birth to a new character type, the other-directed man. Previously, the nation had cultivated an inner-directed people. They were self-reliant individualists who internalized self-discipline and moral standards. However, morality and ideals now came from the overarching desire to conform, and we see the 1950s marked by this era of conformism. William H. White's Organization Man, published in 1956, a study of the Chicago suburb of Park Forest, portrayed people obsessed with fitting into their communities and jobs. In place of the old Protestant work ethic, middle-class suburbanites now sought a comfortable, secure niche in the system. In White Collar, C. Wright Mills scathingly analyzed the job culture of middle-class salaried employees, office workers, and bureaucrats. In his book, The Power Elite, published in 1956, Mills warned that a small, interconnected group of corporate executives, military men, and political leaders had come to dominate American society, giving unprecedented power to what Eisenhower later termed the military-industrial complex. American higher education experienced rapid growth after the war, with enrollments growing from 2.6 million in 1950 to 7.2 million in 1970, as the GIs and their baby boom children went to school, mainly in growing public institutions. Because college students, married men, fathers, and grad students got draft deferments, while married male high school graduates faced introduction into the armed force, college represented an important line dividing classes in post-war America. Colleges and universities, by and large, accepted the values of post-war corporate culture, offering business and professional degrees that became a gateway to the middle class. Businessmen were increasingly represented on university boards of trustees, and universities were increasingly run like businesses, with administrators adopting the language of input, output, cost-effectiveness, and quality control. Some things don't change. Although improvements in medical care, such as polio vaccines, meant longer and healthier lives, more sophisticated treatments and expensive new hospital facilities sharply increased the costs of healthcare, leaving the poor and elderly Americans unable to afford modern medicine. Thousands of rural communities and small towns lacked doctors or decent hospital facilities. Critics of the medical establishment charged that the proliferation of medical specialists and large hospital complexes had increased the number of unnecessary surgical operations, especially for women and children. The American Medical Association, the AMA, which certified medical schools, did nothing to increase the flow of new doctors. Some things also didn't change here. Truman had proposed national health insurance to be run along the lines of Social Security, while Eisenhower had sold government assistance to private health insurance companies. The AMA denounced both proposals as socialized medicine and blocked their adoption, something that sounds very familiar to us today. On another level, we see 1948, an Indiana University entomologist, Alfred Kinsey, looked at the behaviors of American men and women, and he published a a book, The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, followed 5 years later by Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. He was criticized because his study, he ended up having relations with some of his subjects, and the study only looked at one demographic of society. However, his book demystified sex